Today we're going to look at two plastic panoramic cameras. The first is the Holga 135 Pan or Panoramic. Amazing camera, just very difficult to find. And the second camera is Lomography's Sprocket Rocket camera. And we're going to try to accomplish four things in this video. First, I'm going to briefly compare and contrast the two cameras. Then, two, we're going to go into the studio and I'm going to completely deconstruct the Sprocket Rocket camera. We're going to break it all the way down to as far as we can and look at the construction and look at what modifications we might like to make to it to make it a better camera. Three, we're going to talk about modifications to the two cameras and what I've done for my own personal work. And then four, I'm going to show you sample images. Let's talk about the similarities. Well, they both shoot 35mm film. They both have a frame counter. They both have a hot shoe. They both use essentially the same shutter speed, bulb in 1/100 of a second, and the same f-stops, f11 and f16. They both have the ability of doing unlimited multiple exposures, and they're very compact and fairly well built. Where they differ though, the biggest one is in the lens. The Holga comes with two lenses. It has a 55mm lens and a pinhole lens, and you can switch the lenses even mid-roll. The 55 lens has 4 focusing points, like all Holga lenses do. Whereas on the Lomo Sprocket Rocket, it has one lens, doesn't come off, and the lens is a 30mm, so it's much wider angle than the Holga is. And it has 2 focus settings. It has basically 0.6 to 1 meter and 1 meter to infinity. And the camera is really sharp and has incredible depth of field. However, by having that incredible depth of field, you don't get the out of focus rendering that you sometimes can get very nicely with the Holga on closer shots. So it's a little bit of a give and take there. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go in the studio and I'm gonna deconstruct the camera all the way down, as I mentioned, to just the basic screws and plastic components. We're gonna look at how it's built, look at what modifications we might wanna make, and then I'm going to show you some sample images. So let's get to it. All right, so in this part of the video, I'm going to completely deconstruct a Sprocket Rocket camera. Here's one that's brand new, that has no modifications to it. And I'm going to take this one here apart because this is my test one. But we're going to break this camera down to the guts and see what's really on the inside. The reason I do this with a lot of my cameras is I like to modify my cameras to fit what I need. So the tools you're going to want to have if you want to do stuff like this is a good set of screwdrivers. Now, I bought these on Amazon at the suggestion of a friend of mine who's a brilliant engineer, and these are all Master Mechanic, just really nice small screwdrivers. I'd get a set of those right off the bat. I have my standard bag here of just different size Allen wrenches in all sorts of different configurations, but for this we're not going to need any of that. I always like to have a good micrometer. This is like 20 bucks at most at like a Home Depot or Ace or anything like that. And that's really great. Now, when I take these cameras apart, a lot of times I'll have spare parts left over because this particular one here is going to be a donor camera. All the parts on this can be used if my primary cameras got hurt in any way, shape, or form. Though I will say the Sprocket Rocket is a very solid feeling camera. There's not a whole lot that could go wrong. And you'll see why I say that once we start to take it apart. So I've already taken apart the front on this one though. So all I'm going to mention is if you look at the front of your Sprocket Rocket, and here is once again one that has not been modified, it has what looks like 2 screws on the front. Those are not screws. They're simply rivets that are pushed in. They look like this. Hold on, I got 2 of them here. They look just like this. You can see there's no thread or anything on them. And all you have to do is use a very small flathead screwdriver like this, and you can put it underneath them and work them and pop them out. I also then always take off this metal front mask. I'll get into why later. Now, as I said, this particular model, I've already taken the front lens apart, so I'm just gonna remove that for right now. If we go to the back of the camera, the way that I'm gonna open this thing up is we'll take the back off, set that to the side. And then there are 4 screws on the inside down here that allow you to take out this inner chamber. Let's first take out the mask that allows you to shoot 24 by 72mm panoramic images without having the sprocket holes. This is one of my favorite ways of working. And down here in these corners, see if I can get you to see that. Here, 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 and here, there are 4 very small screws. So what we're gonna do, I like to use a slightly larger Phillips for this. I'm going to loosen these up. You take them out. Sometimes they get a little sticky. That's that front lens. We got to care for that. Sometimes they get a little sticky when they're coming out, but let's see here. Oh, another thing too on these particular cameras, when you put the camera back together, don't over tighten the screws. They should be set tight, like, till they stop, but don't think you have to keep turning. It is plastic. You will wreck the sockets at some point if you keep doing that. So let me see here. I gotta take it off camera for a second. I couldn't see it. All right, 2. There's 2 more over here. More screw to take out right here. Okay, so there's the 4 screws. Now this cassette right here all comes out as one piece. You just give it a little pull. And it's nice if you can keep this mechanism here intact. This is just the counter wheel, and it's on a spring system. And this is your wheel right here that turns, and you can see that little white dot appears. There's the white dot right there. So I'm always careful not to have this pop off. It's not hard to fix it and put it back on. It literally just takes a second, but you got to think about it. So leave this standing up like this off to the side. So now when we look on the inside, we have our flash wires right here going down, and we have a cover plate in here protecting the back of the lens assembly. On the top, I'm not going to bother taking off these 2 wind mechanisms here, though I will show you what I did on mine to make it better. Actually, first, let's take a look at the viewfinder here. This is something that I also like to take apart, because the viewfinder in this camera is not very accurate, and that's being generous by saying that. It actually like really sucks. And I decided to take it out and to put the camera on a tripod with a little ground glass across the back here when the mask was in, and to figure out what the crop lines really were for the negative. This particular screw here is a little stripped. Once again, remember I said don't over tighten these things? I had done that on this one at one point. And at this point, it's just sort of spinning in there. You could always put a little dot of glue or something in there if you wanted to. So then this pops off. You have to be careful when you pull this out, because you don't want to rip the wires off, the contacts. If you did, it's a simple resolder. And there's a lot of wire in here. I mean, there's a lot. But if you flip it like this and fold the 2 wires to the side, you can pull this out just by giving it a little tension on both sides. Hold on. There we go. And this piece of glass, or plastic, pops out. And as you can see on the front of mine, I've used a little bit of black gaffer's tape and masked it to exactly match what the camera looks like when you're using this. So my framing is really good now. I can tell you what the measurements are, so you don't have to do the ground glass. Get yourself a micrometer and cut 2 pieces of tape, black tape, that as you can see are 5 millimeters thick. So 5 millimeters thick and long enough to cover it. You do that on the top and you do that on the bottom. The gap in the middle should be just under 5 millimeters. It should be like 4.5, the gap right there. That's close enough that you've got margin for error. So once you've got that masked, you can simply pop it back in. Once again, we'll be careful not to wreck these wires. Sometimes it just pops in nicely. Sometimes you've got to give it a little push here on the front. There we go. So it's going in. Almost. There we go. It's back in. So then this just goes back into the housing. And you have to be careful with the wires though when you do that, because you don't want to break anything. So I get it going in, and then on the top here, I pick up some of that slack wire like that. Make sure the 2 wires here go down into these little slots when you do that. It's not hard. Push these in and just take your time doing this. If you've done it right, you only have to do this once. And the masking, as I said, if you use the measurements that I just gave you, are absolutely perfect for general shooting. Okay, just get that in. There we go. Just stay in there. There we go. Make sure that these two are going to be in the hole. They are. And you can see now nothing's being pinched. And now the front, we have a nice mask. So it's not something that you're going to stick or bump. It's actually behind the plastic guard here. And it's really nice to look through. So now let's get into the guts of the camera itself. What I'm going to do is unscrew here. I've taken this apart enough that I know where the different screws are and where they go on the camera. If this was my first time doing it, I would either videotape myself as I am now, or I would have a piece of paper laid out and I would label what screws are going to what component, just so you can put it back together easier. Okay, take this screw out. All right. And then this whole mask right here on the inside just comes out. Now you can see at the top, there's a notch and then another notch. The first notch goes around, the big one around here, and this other smaller notch right here is what holds the wires in place. So when you reassemble it, you just want to make sure those red wires go inside of that notch. So we'll set this off to the side. So now here we are looking at the inside. You can see the flash contacts to the back of this board. And what we're going to do, there are 3 screws, 1, 2, 3. We're going to loosen these screws. This is what's holding the lens assembly to the front of the camera. You don't have to take them all the way out. Just get them out enough that it gives and breaks free. That also means you don't lose those screws because they're nicely stuck right here. Okay, and I can feel that that's just like, oh, almost. There we go. Okay, so if I flip this over, this gives us our first good look at the inside. Let's take a look here at the inside now. As you can see, it's a really simple shutter mechanism, and I love simple. Simple doesn't break. It literally is a simple spring, and these springs are not impossible to find. You can get them at, mechanic stores. A lot of hardware stores will sell them. So if this broke, this would be an easy mechanism for me to fix if I had to. So let's set this aside now. And let's take a look at this assembly here. So here is the back side of the lens. There are 2 optics in this lens. So you've got your 2 shutter speed, your 2 f-stops here. This is the selector switch for your f-stops. You can see it's got like a little detent. You can hear the sound of it doing it. That's these detents right here and here. They're hitting on this little metal pin, and that's how it locks. It just hits on this little pivot point right here. So we're going to set that off to the side. And you could, by the way, you could modify these f-stops right here. It's basically F11 and F16, so F11, F16. I could drill this out a little bit, or I could put smaller f-stops on top of this. Think like a really thin pinhole. You could put that on here and make this F32, F45, F64, whatever you wanted, and just glue it. I've done that with good success on a lot of these cameras. So we'll set that aside. We'll set the shutter speed selector switch aside. Okay, so let's take a look at this piece now. So now we're looking at the back, and we can see there are 3 screws, 1, 2, 3, that are holding this assembly to what holds the lens assembly in. So we're going to take and remove those screws. So 1, not quite out. 2, and the 3rd one is here. Okay. When this comes off, you will see that it literally just pulls straight up. And there are orientations that this has to go on when it goes back on. I'll talk about that when I reassemble it. Now we're looking at the rear element of the lens, and you can see there are pivots here. These 2 things pivot. This is what makes the lens go back and forth from the 1 meter close focus to the further distance. And then there's also the lens here itself, that this has a pivot. So all 6 of these points lock into here and just provide a really solid construction. Now these here, if you want to take this apart even more, there are 3 screws that work as a retainer to hold this rear element in to capture it. So take this out. It's not easy recording this and doing it at the same time. Okay. So then this comes off, and then this whole cog here comes off. And then here is the rear element. It can just pop right out. And on the front of this normally would be, I'll show you, this assembly like this. So there are 4 more screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that then removes the front plate, and then you have access to the front element. There's all sorts of things you could do at this point. Let's say you like to work with a red filter and you don't want to put the auxiliary filter ring on the outside like I did on this, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's one option. You could put a filter in here. You could just do all sorts of stuff, and I like the fact that I now understand how this camera comes apart. Putting it back together is actually quite simple. I'll walk you through the steps. I'm going to take this out because we don't need it. And these are things that are just important when you put it back together. So make sure the orientation of the lens is proper. The bubble side is out. And then I put into here. This is an important step because I do it backwards every single time. So this mounts onto here like this. Got to make sure it lines up, because you can see on the side here there are ramps, and that's like its basic sort of helical focusing concept, and that has these 3 studs right here, and those ride up and down those ramps. So it's important that it lines up properly. So all I'm going to do is just make sure that orientation is good, and you know it's right when it seats in like that. Then you can turn these and they move. Oops, wait a second. Yes, I did that right. You can make sure that they move like that. Put it down flat. As you can see on the back here, on the lens retaining ring, there's a little tiny hole right here. That hole goes on this little tiny stud right here. That tells you that you are in the proper orientation for this lens ring on the back. It goes just like that. Then we have 3 small screws to put into the back. And once you do that, this ring is captured. And don't over tighten it, just like that. That's all you want to do. If you go really tight, you're going to warp this plastic ring. And when you go to try to focus the camera, it's like really stiff. So you don't want to do that. Don't over tighten. Okay. And here is the third one. Now, when you go to mount this ring back on this ring, the way that I like to do it is I turn all of these to their fullest extent. I want everything to be kind of in the same position, so it's all the way over to this side. These are over and this is over, so it's all turned. And then this only goes on one way. There's only one way it goes on here proper, and it's really just a matter of, once again, there is 6 holes that are going to line up. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they really only go on one way. So I look at the configuration of the holes and I just try to see how it's going to fit, and it might take a few minutes. It is very specific. There we go. That actually went pretty quick. So now what I do, once again, there are 3 screws in here that I have to put back in. So I've got my 3 screws. Once again, we are not going to over tighten it. Perfect. Next screw. The next screw. And I a lot of times make videos of myself deconstructing cameras while I'm doing it. And the reason is that way, if I really screw up, I can literally just watch my video to put it back together. So now we've got this all back in place. This all moves proper, so that's good. The next thing to do is, and once again, yours would have a lens in this plate mounted on like that already. I can't do that because I destroyed this plate in the process of making it. Next thing we want to do is put the f-stop selector switch back in. Quite simple, it's just like that. We want to put the shutter speed selector switch back in. Once again, quite simple. Goes right on top of this stud. Just like that. Okay. And then in order to put this and the lens assembly here in the body back together, I find the easiest way is to have the orientation proper, leave this on the ground because these two little parts want to go falling all over the place, and just try to line it back up like this, and it'll fall into place pretty quickly if you're just careful about it. Just gotta get it to find the holes perfectly. There we go. So it's back on, and now what I'm gonna do is it's all pressed together. There are the 3 screws back here. If you remember, I didn't take them out, but these 3 screws now lock the lens onto the body. Once again, I'm not gonna over tighten. These I wanna just make sure are just a little bit more energy because of course they're holding the lens to the body. Okay, and now before I go any further, I always check, yep, that has a nice feel. That feels good. Shutter's firing. Everything's good to go. Next piece to go back in is this, and once again, remember, there's these 2 notches at the top. One goes around this screw post. The other one, this notch here, is for the 2 wires. And so you just don't want to accidentally pinch and get one of those wires cut. Otherwise, you'll be experiencing the joy of soldering. Then I'm going to take 2 screws. Actually, it's these 2 right here, slightly longer. I'm going to take these 2 screws here, put them back in here. Okay. Put another one in here. All right, now we have to put this assembly back in once again. As long as this hasn't fallen off, you're doing fine. The E on the top should always be right here next to the white dot when you put it in. It's always there. It's on a spring system that it advances forward to the last frame, and then when you rewind, it always goes back. So I put this in something like this just so nothing can fall out. Line it up, push it in, and if I look on the top, the E and the white dot are perfect in there. Now what I'm gonna do is put the 4 screws back in these corners. And it's a little hard to do while I'm trying to film, but let me try one more time. They're really recessed in there, but not hard to get to. Some cameras, you realize the engineers who designed never wanted you to take them apart because they're so complex. These cameras are pretty straightforward, and that's what I like about them, is that if I've got 3 or 4 of these cameras, which I do, you know, I can use them for parts. I can pull, you know, parts from a broken one or one that I was modifying and kind of screwed up and make it work. Yay. 3 more. These screws have been in and out of this thing a lot. And that's why that one went easy. A little bit more stripped up because I spent an entire day. Last night I was sitting around having a cigar, as you can see in this photo, a nice cocktail, shooting some test film through these 2 cameras, and really thinking about like the modifications that I've been making to them and how I want to use them in my work. And I'll show you some samples here in this video in just a few minutes. Okay, and there's one more. Okay, all the screws are back in. This cartridge is back in. Once again, we'll put this back in the cassette so it's facing up. It does have the word up on there in the orientation, which is kind of nice. Let's make sure it's not bowed or bent. I'm gonna work a little bit on this mask here too. I think it does reflect a little bit of light coming off, and I don't like that. It's either on this edge right here, I think. So I may end up spray painting this mask with stove black flat paint just to cut down on any flare. Of course, we have the 2 screws that go into the viewfinder housing. As I said, this one here has been stripped up pretty good because I've taken that apart like a lot in order to figure out what that proper measurement was for the mask. And so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna talk about some modifications, again, that I made to my version of this camera and why. And I have some sample pictures to show you how all that works. So here's my modified version. So the first thing that I really wanted to do was what I just did in this video. I took one of the cameras apart completely. I wanted to see how the camera felt, how it was made, is it something that I can rely upon? And the reality is this is a really well-built camera. It's very wide angle with the 30mm. It's very different looking than my Holga 135 panoramic. It is definitely, even though the aspect ratio of the negative is the same, this is a 30, that's a 55. And I find that the fall off and the out of focus on the edges is very different as well. I'll get into that when I get to the samples. But what I did in order to mount this ring, so this is a 52 to 55mm step-up ring just by K&F Concepts. I picked it up on Amazon for a few bucks. And then I took, as you can see in the photo, and I sanded the back threads off completely, just on some sandpaper. Only took about 15 minutes, and I sand the threads perfectly smooth. Then I took off the front plate on the camera, as you can see now, taking this off, taking the sockets off, and there's a little lip that runs all the way around. I sanded that lip down smooth. The reason is I want to get this ring as close to the actual lens as I possibly can. So by sanding down that ring, and I literally used my wife's emery board that she uses for her nails, took me 15 minutes, got it perfectly smooth. Then I used, as you can see in this photo, some Gorilla Tape in order to tape and put that together. And then what it gives you at the very end is a really nice filter ring that looks like this. It's super clean, no light coming in from the edges. I use a variable ND filter on this camera. Now, why do I use a variable ND? The problem with this camera is that it's limited in terms of the fact that it has 2 shutter speeds. You got bulb and about 1/100th of a second, and you have 2 f-stops, f11 and f16. By putting a 5-stop variable neutral density filter on here, once again, this is made by K&F Concepts. It's the Nano X series. It's really nice. It's like $45, and each one of these markings on the side represent 1 stop. So I can reduce the light by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops. So between the ability of controlling the light reduction by 5 stops and having 2 different f-stops, this just gives me a lot more control over exposure with this camera. I could also put a red filter, all sorts of different filters on the camera. I put a little bit of gaffer's tape here and 2 strips here. This is a slippery camera, but I find that just that little bit of gaffer's tape, or if you've got like a tactical grip tape, something like that would be a good choice. I also, as I mentioned, put a strip of gaffer's tape around the wine levers. These little suckers are really hard to use, but just putting a little bit of gaffer's tape on them gave me so much more grip. And as we get into winter and rainy weather and stuff, I wanted that extra grip. The back door does concern me because it really is just held on by these 2 little springs and these little flanges on the camera itself. I've read a lot of accounts. People say it doesn't pop off, but I am not super comfortable with that because I just don't see how in time it couldn't accidentally pop off. So my solution is rubber bands. And what I do is I just take a rubber band down here, depends how tight it is, and I'll put like 1, 2 on the camera like that, and we're ready to go. I also have these in black, so it looks fine, but that provides just enough extra assurance that when I'm putting this in my camera bag or putting it down, that I'm not gonna accidentally pop these. I did try to bend these tabs in a little more to see if that makes it stronger. not really, and I started getting worried that I was gonna break it off of the plastic back here. So that's my modifications to this camera. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk a little bit about the differences between this camera and the Holga 135 and where I think they have strengths and weaknesses between the two cameras. And then we will look at some sample images that I've made. Okay, let's now talk about the Holga 135 pan and how it compares to the Sprocket Rocket. What are the strengths and weaknesses? First off, this is a really rare camera. It's very hard to find. You almost never see them come up on eBay, and it's got a lot of great features. You know, it's got a shutter release up here in advance. The viewfinder is absolutely crap. Release button on the bottom. You have the ability of a bulb or normal, which is 100th of a second. You can remove the lens, and it has a pinhole lens that you can put on instead of the regular 55. It's kind of cool. It has an orientation dot at the top. You just line it up, thread it on, and hit lock, and the lens now won't come off. Like all Holgas, it has, you know, your 4 focus settings, you know, infinity, 20 feet or so, 15 feet, let's say 7 feet, and let's say 3 feet. It has a selector on top for f11 and then f16, and it has rewind crank. The inside is quite nice. If you pull up on the lever here, it does have a very nice pressure plate, which I really like. If you remember my video on the Cube Pan, cool part is Steve at Chroma has now created a back plate for the Cube Pan. I'll be sending mine over to him to have him retrofit it. And the inside is really clean and really simple. The camera doesn't feel overly strong. And as I said, my biggest problem with the camera right off the bat was just the viewfinder. So I took a 25 millimeter Voigtlander viewfinder, and much like the masking that I did inside of this camera, I masked this one on top, and it seems to be really good. I always mask these cameras to be just a little tight, knowing that then I'll have that little bit of wiggle room in the end. And like all my Holga cameras, I add a filter ring. This is a, what size is it? A 49 to 52 millimeter filter ring. And what you do is those threads that are on the filter ring, step-up ring, you just sand them down just a whisker, and then they'll push into the front of the Holga lens, and then I can mount my, in my case, a variable ND. So the cameras both have very similar f-stops, very similar shutter speeds. This camera has a lot of cool advantages in the fact that you can wind forward and backwards. You could reverse like this on both sides and tension the film to keep it flatter. The 30 millimeter is great. It's nice that the viewfinder and everything is intact instead of having to do something auxiliary like I had to do on this one. I mean, really, the viewfinder here is just, it's awful. This is not bad. This is a lot wider though. And as a result, you only have 2 focus zones. Your focus zone is from 0.6 to 1 meter, so like wicked close. And then from 1 meter to infinity. So you literally could just leave it on 1 meter to infinity, walk around and shoot all day. And you could shoot, you know, a roll through and then rewind the roll back and shoot it backwards. You can do all sorts of creative things with it. But they do have a very different look in terms of where their out of focus rendering is on the edges. The Holga has a sweet spot in the middle. And I'm going to show this right now in an example image. So we can see here the Holga image. It has this sort of sharpish sort of center, and then it blurs and vignettes out towards the edges. It's really nice, really pleasing. Now remember, this is a 55 millimeter lens, so it's a little longer than the 30 millimeter lens that we're looking at now on the Sprocket Rocket. And as you can see, the Sprocket Rocket is significantly wider, and it's actually sharper. I mean, overall, the image quality is definitely better. It does have a weird out of focus rendering. You'll notice the center is sharp, and then like 2/3 the way out on both sides, there's an out of focus band. And then when you get all the way to the edge, it's actually in focus again, just a little tiny bit. And I think that's kind of interesting that it does it that way. But it's an interesting look. Now, these were both shot, both of these test images that I'm showing you here right now side by side were shot on a tripod at about 3 or 4 seconds long with Ferrania P30 processed in Rodinal 1 to 50. They have a really nice look. I scanned them on the Imicon 646. And I go back and forth on which one I like better. I'm probably going to end up carrying both of these cameras, and the reason is the 55 on the Holga 135 pan sometimes is just a little too long for my work. I'm working sometimes in tight old historic homes, and I need a little bit more room. So I'm probably, as I said, going to carry both of them in a bag because I like them both. I like them both for my working style. But my work, of course, is handheld long exposures, anywhere from 4 or 5 seconds out to several minutes, and I hand hold those shots the entire time. So I went through and I shot a couple of test images last night using Portra 400, and these are the way those look. All right, so here's 2 images that I shot last night. Now these were shot on Portra 400, but I'm thinking black and white right now, so I converted them to black and white for this test. The top image is the Sprocket Rocket, the bottom image is the Holga, and they were shot once again from the same position. Both the exposures were about 8 or 9 seconds handheld at f11. And as you can see, the Sprocket Rocket really gives a great sense of location and space. The Holga is very nice too, but this gets into a little bit what I was talking about earlier, in that in a lot of the places that I shoot, having that ability of having the wider lens, yes, there is more distortion in the frame, but that wider lens just gives me more options. And as it's a handheld image, that weird little bit of out of focus that I was talking about on the Sprocket Rocket, how 2/3 out, you would see a blend, and then when you get all the way to the edge, it would become sharp again. I don't see it on this because, once again, this is my method of shooting. I like long handheld exposures, and I think it feels really good. I like both for different reasons, but of course, I'm going to like the Sprocket Rocket a little bit better in this one than the Holga. But in the other image, I kind of liked the Holga a little bit better. So I guess it just depends how I'm working with the camera. I will say that if I was shooting this camera in a normal way, using the 100th of a second and not doing the long exposures that I do, I think the Holga has a more interesting rendering. But once you get into long handheld exposures, then it becomes a much more even playing field, and I think it just boils down to what's the look that you're wanting for that particular shot. So in conclusion, which camera did you like? Which rendering did you like? Do you own these cameras, and do you want to comment on your experiences working with these cameras? If you have them, please add it to the comment section. I love getting something going back and forth here. I like both. The Sprocket Rocket really kind of has me intrigued right now. I liked that last picture of Eve on the porch in the low light. Just that extra space felt really good. One thing that I am going to do, though, is I'm going to take out the mask on the inside of the Sprocket Rocket. Not so much because I want the sprocket holes, as I'll always crop that off, but I'm curious because the film is only going to be held by a little tiny edge, and I'm wondering if that'll also create some play on the film plane and the camera. Most people wouldn't like that. I actually would probably love that. So once I know the results, I'll share it here in the comments or maybe in another video. But thank you very much for listening. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now go shoot some film.